With only a few days to go before the African National Congress holds its all-important elective conference in Manguang, the business community, civil society and the churches have come out publicly trying to influence the policy debates on the economy and social challenges facing South Africa. Sections of business, including the banking sector, have urged the ANC to be mindful of the impact of policy changes that could impact the economy negatively. However, Professor Steven Friedman, who's the director of the Institute for the Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg, says the policy hype is just that, and that the ANC is unlikely to make a major U-turn on economic policy. I spoke to him earlier.
First of all, if you have a look at the resolutions, most of the panic at the moment is being caused by a resolution on strategic nationalisation. That is actually a restatement of policy which was taken 20 years ago. It essentially means that to the ANC, nationalisation is not a principle, it's a tactic which may be justified by the evidence. In the last 20 years it hasn't been justified by the evidence. It's likely it won't be for the next 20 years. The reality is that the ANC, the majority of executive members of the ANC are shareholding people. They have their own business interests. They're perfectly well aware that they need to live with business in this country, and therefore nobody is going to do anything particularly radical. On the other hand, we are a country with massive inequalities. We have many people in this country who feel that the state should do more about those inequalities, and therefore politicians have to take those people seriously because it's an important section of South African opinion. And the impression is often created that because politicians don't denounce various actions, that they're actually going to take those actions.
But I've gone through the resolutions that were taken at the policy conference, and I agree with you in the main that they might sound radical, but if you unpack them, it's pretty much consistent with the current resolutions that were in fact adopted in 2007 at Polokwane. Absolutely. And of course you trace it back way further. But if one looks at the proposals around, for example, a windfall tax on super profits, if we look at the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, and of course the question of strategic nationalisation, which in ANC terms can mean different things to different people, are those not real indications, if those decisions are taken and firm policy proposals come out, is that not a shift, even if it's not that radical, but is that not a departure from where we are now?
No, there's nothing there which hasn't been there before. That is my point. The windfall tax may be phrased slightly differently to some previous proposals. It's not different from previous proposals. I've dealt with strategic nationalisation. A sovereign wealth fund is an interesting idea, but it's not necessarily a left-wing idea. There will always be new ideas. Society doesn't remain the same. The question is the economic policy framework the same? And it quite clearly is the same. People need not only to read the current documents, but they need to read, as you correctly say, the Polokwane documents, because then you see that very often. Things which are considered terribly radical today were actually adopted in the Mbeki era.
Now, of course, you also in the article point to the difference between what the party decides and what the state and the government actually implements. Now, of course, under the Zuma administration, there has been a much tighter, or an attempt to have a much tighter link between what the state does and what the party does. We've seen in some instances, certainly on state-owned enterprises, that if the party does speak, they can in some instances effect change in terms of government policy, or certainly an approach. Do you think that if the ANC, for example, adopts some of these resolutions, that they're going to have a better chance of enforcing lawmaking on the policy decisions, or do you think that there will be that kind of uneasy coexistence between those deployed in the state and those who remain in the party?
I don't think we should see this as an uneasy coexistence. It's a feature of any democratic society. The governing party might have 66% of the vote, but government actually governs the entire society, not 60% of the society. Yes, you're absolutely correct that there's more direct intervention in state-owned enterprises, but these are state-owned entities. You don't have to deal with a whole lot of private interests. When you have to deal with private interests as a government, you have to negotiate. Does it mean that none of this will ever happen? Not necessarily. necessarily. It depends on how the negotiations pan out. It depends on the positions which the various parties take, and it's something which will be part of our society in the years going forward. But that's what society is always about. There's always negotiation between different positions and different groups.
Now, of course, the ANC is a broad church in terms of ideological and political orientations. You have capitalists, you have communists, you have socialists, you have social democrats, African nationalists, and so on. And the ANC has always been able to kind of cohere around a center in terms of policy orientation. Do you think that at this conference, given the kinds of pressures that we have against the backdrop of a weak global economy, but also growing inequalities, a point that you made earlier, do you think that that center will still cohere in terms of economic policy?
On economic policy, yes. I think there are other issues which will be fault lines. The centre will probably cohere on those issues too, questions like the relationship between money and politics, perhaps attitudes to traditional leadership. But really, if you look at the various documents, and quite frankly, I think there's a lot of hype in business about this, about the massive differences between the National Development Plan and the National Growth Path, etc. They're all within the same framework. There is actually a centre of gravity in ANC economic policy making, and I have no doubt that that centre of gravity will still be there after the conference.
Now, of course, a lot of people argue that the National Development Plan has been heavily contested going in, but we've seen after the handover, Cabinet has in fact signed off on it. Several ANC NEC meetings, which is the highest decision-making body between conferences, have signed off on it. What is the likelihood that the Manguang elective conference signs off on the National Development Plan of the Planning Commission?
Well, if it's asked to, I'm sure it will, because in fact, the point that some of us keep on making, this is a very large document, 450 odd pages. It's a very interesting mix of proposals. I don't think there's a single citizen of this country who, if they read the document, would agree with all of it or disagree with it. That's the nature of the document. When government says it's going to endorse it, it says the kind of process which needs to take place between the interest groups is something that they support. I'm sure that Manguang will support that too.
Now, Trevor Manuel, the minister responsible for planning, in an interview with me earlier, said that the National Planning Commission's recommendations involves a series of trade-offs that has to happen within society. Do you think that the ANC is ready to make those trade-offs, given the fact that there's always this push-pull tension between various interests within the ruling party?
Well, exactly, and that's precisely why the ANC has to make those trade-offs internally. If you go back in our history, if you look at the base document that the ANC got elected on in 1994, the Reconstruction and Development
More radical than the proposals today.
Yes, but the point about the RDP, if you look at the original RDP which Cosatu came up with, and you look at what is adopted, they're very different documents, because there was an internal process of negotiation within the ANC. And that's an ongoing thing. It happens all the time, because as you correctly said at the beginning, there are different interests within the ANC. They have to be kept within the same organisation, and the way you do that is you compromise and you negotiate. And sometimes, quite frankly, you also fudge a bit so that people will stay on board.
Of course, there's been a lot of emphasis on the economy and, of course, the mineral energy complex, but not a lot of focus on land. And yet there's a steady series of proposals coming out on land. Do you think that we're likely to get a more, let's say, radical, for lack of a better word, position on land? And if so, what is the shape and form of that likely to be?
It's a very good example of what I'm talking about. We get quite possibly another resolution saying that willing seller, willing buyer is not acceptable. Willing seller, willing buyer ceased to be governing party policy in 2005. If you look at the documentation coming out of the National Agriculture Department, it's very clear what the strategy is. And I think, that nothing that's going to happen in Manguang will change that. The strategy is to say, look, the Constitution says that we can expropriate at a fair price. The proper institution to decide what a fair price is are the courts. And therefore you will have a situation where if people don't sell in situations where it's considered strategically necessary, they will be expropriated. They will then go to court, and our courts will decide what a fair price is, which is the way the Constitution thought it ought to be done all along.
Now, of course, a lot of people have tied leadership to policy positions, suggesting that if a particular leadership is voted in or out, that you're going to see a change in policy. You obviously don't share that view. We've seen in the last few days the churches, business leaders, all urging the ANC not to make the wrong policy decisions. Do you think that the concern expressed by these groups, A, is justified, and two, do you think that whoever emerges from this conference is likely to usher in a new policy path?
No, I don't think whoever's elected is going to usher in a new policy path, because it's quite clear. I mean, you know, we're talking here, when we talk about economic policy, we're talking about a centre of gravity which has been there for 20 years. 20 years is a long time. And there are no particular pressures which are going, yes, we have problems in the international economy, in the local economy, but not enough to tip that centre of gravity. As far as the lobbying is concerned, one really has to ask what the purpose of the lobbying is. Because really, first of all, any decision, as I've said, which is taken at this conference, which affects any interest group in this country, if it's ever going to become law, government policy is going to be negotiated with this interest group. And there's the uncomfortable feeling that organizations who are lobbying at this stage on policy issues are really saying, please don't say anything at your conference which we don't want to hear. And I think that that's an extraordinarily unrealistic view. We do live in a democracy. People who are opposed to the current policy towards business in this country are allowed to speak. What business should be worrying about, and what other interest groups should be worrying about, is what comes out of the proposal detrimental to their interests? And if it does come out detrimental to their interests, that's the appropriate time to start a negotiation and say, look, you know, you've got to listen to us, we don't like the other. I think this attempt to influence the process beforehand could well prove counterproductive, because you start sending a message to people that you don't take their decision-making processes seriously, and you get people's backs up in that way.